Hello, everyone. This is Aprajita, a story scholar with the 1947 Partition Archive, and it is my pleasure to be your host today. Welcome to the 75 Days of Partition series. This is day 70 of hosting esteemed guests for the series, which will continue till August 17th. Today, we will be speaking to Udayan Das. Let me start by giving a brief bio of him. Udayan Das is an assistant professor, Department of Political Science, St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. He's doing his PhD from the Department of International Relations, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. And he was an oral history apprentice with the 1947 Partition Archive during 2015 to 16. Welcome again, Udayan.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction. Thank you.
So let me jump straight to my first question. Your work on partition research is very fascinating, and I would like to ask you to broadly discuss the nature of connectivity in Bengal pre and post partition.
Right. One of the reasons why I kept the title pre and post partition is to also draw the attention of the listeners and also of everybody else who is interested in partition to the fact that the timelines of pre and post partition and Bengal's connectivity is not something that overlaps right away. Okay, what I mean by that is that the conventional understanding of partition or connectivity because of partition around partition is pretty much that the migration happened in one swipe, and that's also a very Punjab-dominated understanding that the partition migration happened at one swipe. The borders were sealed, the borders were manned, and connectivity was stalled for the post-partition era. The thing with Bengal is that the nature of connectivity is something that doesn't get interrupted or doesn't get fractured right away with the partition. So this pre and post partition, when it comes to Bengal, has its own timelines of what the partition trajectory and what the connectivity trajectory look like. And when we are talking about Bengal, obviously the connectivity around Bengal, we are also taking in the units of parts of Bihar, parts of the present-day Bangladesh, in fact, parts of entire present-day Bangladesh, parts of Assam, the parts of Northeast, including Meghalaya. And this entire unit, if you look at the connectivity of this entire unit, that one of the fascinating aspects of connectivity in this part of the world is that it was pretty much multimodal. So it would be railways, including the steamer, the inland waterways, the road. It was, in a sense, multimodal connectivity that connected different parts of the corridors within this complex, very complex terrain of Bengal and the larger part of the provinces of Bihar, provinces of Northeast. And if you look at this whole trajectory of the connectivity, then the British, if you look at the papers, then the British were not very keen on first developing, let's say, a complex nature going up to the hills. But rather later, they saw that it was in the benefit that if they create a funnel-like structure whereby the entire northeast and the parts of North Bengal, which presently host a lot of tea gardens, would come like a funnel shape, let's say a funnel shape trajectory to Kolkata. So all the connecting points would basically connect the upper hills and the upper parts of Bengal, and also to the stretch of eastern Bengal with Kolkata, which was the center of, let's say, ports, which was the center of the business and trading units in the erstwhile colonial period. What happened as a result of the partition was, of course, that this connectivity, this nature of connectivity underwent a change. The border controls became much more tighter. There was a passport regime that was introduced. But it did not right away break from 1947, as we see in the case of Punjab, as we see in the case of the western part of India. The connectivity, in fact, remained till 1965. In fact, if I could just point out three very important trains that were there, the East Bengal Express, the East Bengal Mail, and the Borishal Express. These were the three trains which linked west of Bengal to the east of Bengal, even further to the north, till 1965. And until the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War happened, these three trains were operational. I mean, one, the East Bengal Express would basically operate from Shialda to Gualombo, which is a very interesting port, which I find in several interview descriptions as a very cosmopolitan, very bustling port, right at the trijunction of the Padma and Brahmaputra. And there is another, the East Bengal Mail, which will go from, let's say, the Shialda station, which was erstwhile the Kolkata station, the Calcutta station, which will go from there to Parbatipur Junction, which is up in the north of Padma, which is closer to Rangpur. And then the Borishal Express, which will go from Shialda to Khulna, which is again, it'll be stopping at Gualombo, it will be ferrying across. And these ferries were all connected with the train, with the railways. For instance, the East Bengal Express would leave at the late hours of the night from Shialda. It will go and drop all the passengers in Gualombo in the morning, and in the morning, until and unless the passengers were dropped, the ferry services would actually wait. And the ferry services, the steamer services, were also called East Bengal Express. So the passengers would exactly be dropped by an East Bengal Express through rail and would take up an East Bengal Express through water, the inland waterways, which will take them to different parts of Dhaka, Faridpur, Bikramganj, and even up to Sylhet for some instance. So the nature was multimodal. The nature of connectivity was multimodal. That's point. That's the first point. The second point was that the nature of connectivity did not get disrupted right away with partition. In fact, the pre and post partition, the timelines that we see in conventional wisdom, conventional understanding, are not exactly the timelines that are followed when it comes to Bengal, when it comes to Bengal's connectivity, given the fact that these trains also operated till 1965.
Thank you, Dan. That's a very interesting piece of information you shared there. Would you also like to talk about like what was the nature of migration in Bengal during partition years, and how did connectivity across the complex terrain in Bengal work to ensure the passage of people?
So when I started interviewing people for the Partition Archive, and anybody who has a little bit of interest in Bengal partition would also know that the nature of migration in Bengal did not happen in one swipe, but happened in various phases. Okay, so there is a temporal dimension to this whole migration. The migration happens in several phases. It happens in several spurts, in several parts. Uh, and the reasons of migration in Bengal are also very different. It's not let's say, violence that took genocidal proportions in Punjab. The migrations happened in a spurt, and the border was literally sealed and manned, militarized after this point. In Bengal, there were a complex matrix of reasons because of which migration happened. For instance, the fear psychosis of violence more than violence was also one of the reasons why the migration happened. The migration happened also according to the nature of social hierarchy in Bengal. For example, the upper and the middle class people migrated in the beginning, and the lower and the middle class people who were much more attached to their land, for example, agricultural laborers, they tried their best to stay back in several parts, and until it was not possible, then they migrated later on. There was another layer of people who migrated because their owners and their service providers basically migrated from the east of Bengal. So when I spoke to various people, when I spoke to people who migrated from east of Bengal, they kept telling me and they kept giving me this idea that connectivity was very fluid even after independence. So people would come here to study, they would have some relative here. I'm talking about, let's say, primarily the upper and the middle class people. They would come to Kolkata to study, to get a job. They would go back during Durga Puja in the east of Bengal. And that one leg was always there in the city. So it was much easier for them to come back and get settled in the city at some point of time when they thought that it was not worth living there. It was more dangerous living there. Uh, and that kind of started this question in me that if the migration happened steadily and there was a regularity of migration, then what really aided this regularity of migration? What is it that facilitated this whole migration? And connectivity was the answer to that. The nature of migration, as a result of which happened in phases. In fact, very interestingly, one of the big spurts of migration that happened was, of course, in 1950. The riots that happened in 1950 that pushed a lot of people into West Bengal. Then, there again, very interestingly, in 1964, when the Hazratbal shrine incident happened, that incident very strangely had a lot of impact, and a lot of people migrated because of the communal tensions that started happening in as late as 1964. So the question started from there, that if people regularized migration in this way, and people still maintained two establishments for a long time. One part of their family was in Bangladesh. Their parents were probably in Bangladesh because they would not leave their roots. They would not come. Somebody who is much more middle aged, who is my interviewee, would basically transfer to this side of the border, would work and go every now and then, come back. In fact, somebody showed me a joint India-Pakistan passport. I mean, some of us could really believe the fact that there can be a hyphenated passport between India and Pakistan, but that was the case till I think roughly about the person mentioned that roughly about 1953 till we had a joint passport. So I mean, people of my generation and later would find it very hard to believe that in fact there can be a joint passport as such. So I found the whole nature of migration in Bengal very regularized, very nuanced in terms of the character, in terms of the temporal dimensions, in terms of the causal explanations of why migration happened in Bengal. And also, like I started off with, that 1947 is the timeline in terms of the pre and post. But when it comes to Bengal, this timeline is difficult to grapple in terms of Bengal's migration, because how do we put a line when the migration is happening at a regular basis even after until 1960s, 19, let's say 1970s, of course, the Bangladesh war element that comes in. Yeah, so pretty much so.
So then you shared a piece of information about the passports, that people possess passports of both, a joint passport of
Yeah,
Bangladesh and Bengal. So are these
right.
stories are also recorded for the archive?
Yes, yes, I distinctly remember that one of my interviews, I had also clicked a picture and I had also uploaded it while I was taking the interview. That the passport was a hyphenated passport. It was white in color, I distinctly remember, and it was written India-Pakistan passport. Okay, so that was very interesting. That person had still kept it, and they had kept it as a memory. Okay, so the way we see in India and Pakistan, the way we imagine India and Pakistan is not always verses, but it might also be hyphenated.
Yeah, that's where we get to know that the partition, we cannot give just one definition, and there were partitions actually that happened during that time.
Right. Yeah.
So you talked
Absolutely right.
about fluid connectivity throughout all these years, till 1965. But also tell us that how partition ruptured the nature of connectivity in the Bengal region with political borders, and whereas it navigated a tumultuous zone despite the lack of communication development in the early years.
Yeah, if I could just share a picture which I have, I think, made a very simpler illustration of this whole thing. So if you could just look at this map, then the map will give you an idea about what kind of railway tracks or what kind of communication lines were there between the entire region of Bengal and parts of Assam as well. So if you look at this part, now Google has taken the liberty to mark a blueprint on where I stay, but this is Calcutta. Uh, Down at the end. So I explained the whole funnel structure in the beginning. So it pretty much looks like that. If you move from Kolkata, you see a G here right at the junction of Brahmaputra and Padma. That's Goalondapur. And right beside that, there is a D mark, which is basically Damodiyapur. The HB is basically the Harding Bridge, incidentally named after the person, after the viceroy who reunited Bengal in 1912. And these were the ferry stations where the train from Kolkata would basically go and drop the passengers. The passengers would migrate, would shift from one part of the Padma or the Brahmaputra. They would move to another part with the help of ferry. Dhaka is here, and this line that you see straight from Harding Bridge onwards, which is Shantahar Junction, there's Parbotipur Junction, and up in Shiliguri. This was the line that basically connected the south of Bengal to north of Bengal. And incidentally, all the lines that connected the south of Bengal to north of Bengal went from the east of Bengal. So, as a result of which, when the partition happened, there was no line that was linking basically the north of Bengal and the south of Bengal. Okay, so until and unless the Farakka Bridge was built in 1975 and the New Jalpaiguri station came up in 1960s, the tea gardens of the north and the districts of the north were basically not very well connected to the south of Bengal, to Calcutta, because the most important trains and the most important junctions, in fact, all of the networks went from east of Bengal, which came into Bangladesh for that matter. So, as a result of which, the first rupture that happened because of partition was that if you see the international boundary here, then all the railway lines are on the right side of the international boundary. So, there's nothing on the left side of the international boundary. So, the tracks between North Bengal and South of Bengal faced the first fracture in terms of the partition connectivity, and that took, let's say, a couple of decades to come up with, where a line between Shiliguri and Kolkata was established. In fact, the present day Darjeeling Mail that we talk about, which is a very popular train if somebody wants to go to hills, somebody wants to go to Darjeeling from Calcutta, used to run in two shifts. Darjeeling Mail from Calcutta will go to Goalando or will go to Damugdia. Then people would have to cross the ferry, they would have to cross the Padma River, they would have to take a train from Saroghat station, and that will basically take them to Parbatipur and then to Shiliguri. Incidentally, another track that is there, which also suffered because of partition, which is absolutely at the right end, what you see, which is from Chittagong up to Dibrugarh. So it was from Chittagong, it would go to Dhaka and Chandpur, which is on the right side of the delta. Then it would go via uh, let's say it would go via Silchar to Lumjing, and then far up in the right, you see a D pointed out. I even couldn't scale it because Dibrugarh is even further. So the two lines from there would join basically. The line from Chittagong would go to Dibrugarh, and there is also a line that will go from Parvatipur to Dibrugarh. And this is another casualty that we see because of partition, that after partition happened, or after these lines were disjunctured in 1965, even more, at least there was some sort of a communication that was left in the 1950s, 1960s, but absolutely got sealed after the 1965 war. Northeast became an absolute casualty of this whole partition fracture of connectivity that we see. So partition literally made Northeast something which was land linked to landlocked. And it took several years for India to basically develop a track which would go from New Jalpaiguri and which basically go till Northeast, go till Guwahati and Assam, bypassing the regular connections, bypassing the natural connections that were already there since the colonial period, during the colonial period. So these were the two basic ruptures that we see. These were the two basic ruptures that I found very interesting. That Bengal, north and south, the connectivity of north and south. In fact, for several years, the north and south of Bengal did not have an intersecting point. It was 9 years after independence, from 1947 to 1956. North Bengal and South Bengal did not share borders. It was only in the reorganization of the states that happened in 1956 that a small strip of Bihar was allocated to Bengal, so that the north of Bengal and the south of Bengal could actually have a conduit, let's say, strip of land to connect each other. And also the northeast, which is Assam, Meghalaya, which were so well connected with the catchment areas of Bangladesh, which were so very well connected with the Bay of Bengal, with parts of the delta. They also suffered a landlockedness that even today we are discussing. We are talking about foreign policy in terms of northeast, the look east, and the act east, in order to get past that whole landlocked nature that blocks northeast. But the block actually happened because of the fact that these connections that were there, that were operational, these multimodal operational connections that were there, were brutally ruptured after partition.
Udayan, I think this is a very neglected area when it comes to partition studies. That how Northeast was affected due to it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
how, and for the fact that it was affected, it became landlocked because of the boundaries that were drawn due to partition. It continues to have ramifications for political context in the present era, and how these
Uh,
things can be linked and studied. And your findings are very interesting in that way. Uh,
Yeah, because I
at
always
last,
emphasize on the fact that Bengal had two partitions, not just one. I mean, there's one partition which we often talk about, which is the line that is very visible in terms of West and East Bengal. But there's another very complex partition that happens in the northeast and east of Bengal, parts of Sylhet, even the north of Bengal, parts of Rangpur. These areas are very neglected. Even in Bengal, we talk mostly about the east and west partition of Bengal.
would you also like to shed some light on your experience and journey of being an oral history apprentice at the archive, and what was your major learning during your time?
Yeah, well, if I could recall, then there are three very important things that I would like to talk about when it comes to archive and my experience. The first was that I come from a very vertical social science. Okay, so we talk about statist narratives. We are mostly about state accounts and a very top-down view of history, a very top-down view of politics, of society. Uh, Archive challenged me with that idea and gave me a newer perspective, a newer frame of looking at history from top down rather than let's say bottom up rather than top down. It gave me an idea that there is also a history that exists beyond these narratives, which are authoritative in terms of their propagation or understanding. The second thing is not only that there is an alternative history that exists, there is alternative history that is also accessible. So when you're accessing a history, you need not look it through a smoke screen of somebody else, but you can directly have nobody in between the history and you. So the history, in this case, an interviewee, a voice, a person is basically sharing lived experiences of history with me. So the first time I'm keeping something in public history in terms of oral histories as in the foreground and other matters which I have always read in history books in the background. Okay, so when I'm connecting the dots from behind, I'm connecting the dots from people to let's say the larger narratives. And finally, of course, I think everybody would who has worked with the archive or who has worked as a story scholar, as a historian in terms of oral history, would also agree that the interview has an effect on you, which stays. I mean, whether it's a question, whether it's a doubt, whether it's a crisis, whether it's joy, sadness, whatever it is, uh, the interview has an effect and that stays on with you, which is one of the things that I have. I mean, you will have interviews which will keep you awake for the rest of the night. You'll have interviews which will make you very emotional while going back home because you're talking to someone and that person is basically opening up a life in front of you, lived experiences in front of you. So that I think makes you a very humble person. That makes you also a person who is aware of the fact that there are so many narratives out there, and the one that you are probably reading is one amongst the many narratives that are straddling the space. For me, I mean, when it comes to connectivity, when it comes to this issue, I've always realized that one larger takeaway, and that has always influenced my work as well a lot and will continue to influence, is that the way we perceive geography to be, which is very static, very permanent, is not something which is as static as permanent as we see it to be. It's much more, I mean, conflated, inflated, it dilates, it also contrasts. I mean, geography is something which is also a handmaiden of history and also a handmaiden of politics. So this is probably one of the larger takeaways that I've had in terms of looking at connectivity in Bengal, looking at partition in Bengal, and in fact that will stay with me, and that's entirely because of the archive.
Yes, I would completely agree with you that the interviews affect us just for the fact that we are so involved when we are when we are interacting with the lived memory, and the experience completely transforms the way you exist as a more aware person. You look around yourself and see that you become more empathetic. You become more open to newer things, and your horizon just widens, and it's amazing.
Absolutely,
uh,
absolutely,
thank
I agree.
th- Thank you for coming here today, Udayan. It was very pleasant talking to you and listening to all your findings and research that you have done. They are brilliant. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Uh, and those who are joining us, please tune in next week for another amazing conversation with Dr. Kavita Daya. The 1947 Partition Archive is hosting this series to commemorate 75 years of partition. This series is a daily micro podcast series being aired for 75 days between June 3rd and August 17th, except Sundays, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of partition in 2022. For context, August 17th is the day the Boundary Commission announced the Radcliffe Line separating India and Pakistan. 75 days after the Partition Plan was announced on June 3rd, 1947. Thank you very much again, and please show us your love and support by sending the hearts and like emojis under the video. For any query, DM us on social media or connect with any of our team members.